Good afternoon, Dr. Subramanian, ladies and gentlemen. We are very proud and privileged to present an interview with Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Just a brief introduction. Subramanian is an alumnus of IIT Kanpur, IIM Calcutta, and the top-ranked Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, which has nurtured several winners of Nobel Prize for Economics. Dr. Subramanian was appointed Chief Economic Advisor to the Union Government in December 2018 after acquiring 5 years of work experience with JP Morgan Chase, ICICI Bank, Tata Consulting Services. Simultaneously, Dr. Subramanian is also a tenured professor of finance at the top-ranked Indian School of Business, Hyderabad. Earlier this year, Dr. Subramanian was the prime author and architect of the brilliantly written Economic Survey 2019-20, which proposed a clean break with India's 40-year-old, quote, dalliance with socialism, unquote, and reversion to the path of the subcontinent's ancient tradition of free markets and enterprise, and free enterprise. Thank you very much, Dr. Subramanian. Now let me pose the first question to you, which is firstly, congratulations for authoring the path-breaking Economic Survey 2020, which for the first time in living memory unambiguously recommends that the Union government in Indian society repudiates its post-independent socialist ideology legacy and reverts to its ancient and very successful traditions of free markets and free enterprise. What has been the reaction of the BJP government at the center and the establishment to this recommendation?
I'm very glad to state, Dilip, that it's been unequivocally supportive. I think the first evidence of this support is actually seen in the several reforms that have been announced, which actually, capture the spirit of free enterprise, reducing the role of state, enabling the private sector, for efficiencies, need for reforms in the factor markets and overall reforms itself. So the response has been very, very, very good. And I think partly it is because what we recognized in the economic survey, something that, us Indians have not paid as much attention to, is the research by Angus Madison, where he documents the contribution to GDP over the last 2 millennia. And, for 3/4 of known economic history, that is still 1750 AD, India accounted for more than 1/3 of the global GDP.
Global GDP.
Just to give you a sense of this dominance, United States is recognized as the economic superpower, and it has been there for about half a century. And it has accounted for anywhere about 15 to 16% of world's GDP, at its maximum. Thereabouts. I may not be getting the figures exactly right, but that is the order of magnitude. Now, compare that 50 years, half a century versus 17 and a half centuries. Yes. And 15% of contribution to world GDP or thereabouts versus more than 33%. 33%. You put those together, then you start really appreciating the kind of dominance that India had, which then makes you wonder what such kind of dominance cannot happen just through accident. It has to be through design. And what were the elements of that design? That is what really, that's what started our quest for, finding out what were the elements of that thinking. And what we discovered are actually timeless principles, that create prosperity. It's the combination of free enterprise, as captured in Adam Smith's words of the invisible hand of markets, together with the hand of trust. And that hand of trust itself deriving its vitality from the from the deep spiritual ethos that India had, and which India has provided to the rest of the world. Even in India itself, after 1991, the evidence that we provided, and actually that's where the marriage of modern economic thinking and modern economic methodology to ancient Indian thinking has really been brought about. That evidence is very clear even after 1991 that these timeless principles indeed hold good, and it's actually been reflected in literature, and I use that word literature, not scriptures, by the way, as disparate as Arthashastra, written in Sanskrit and read mostly in the northern part of India, and Tirukkural, in the southern part of India by Saint, in Tamil. So, as disparate literature as these have talked about, and so, I therefore believe that, during, of course, our colonization by the British, and then after that, the quote unquote tryst with socialism, we basically deviated from these timeless principles, and now we're coming back to those timeless principles. And I think the reforms that have been announced are basically are in that spirit. So therefore,
do you think, would you say the reforms, for example, the labor reforms, the agriculture reforms, are perhaps reflective of this new thinking?
Absolutely, absolutely. Not just that, but even the announcement as part of the COVID package about the privatization agenda. Now,
Yes.
where the government has stated that except for a couple of few strategic sectors, every other sector the government will have no business being in business, and even in the in these sectors, the number of state-owned enterprises will be limited to 4. If you recall, in the economic survey, we had a chapter specifically titled Privatization and Wealth Creation, where we showed how privatization actually creates wealth. And so I think this is for a statement of intent. This is incredibly important because this comes in the backdrop of the socialistic past, where wealth and wealth creation was only thought about as a necessary evil. For the first time, the government in its document used the word privatization, and that's been reflected in the agenda. So overall, I think, partly because this is a marriage of what is truly Indian economic thinking with with modern economic principles, I think the traction has been excellent, and in fact the Honorable Prime Minister himself mentioned this as well, about the ideas in the survey.
Yeah. To what extent do you agree with the statement that after the world 1950, after World War II, actually Indian industry, private industry, was poised really to take over all of Asia, because we had pioneer industries like J.R.D. Tata, the Tatas, Birla, Walchand Hirachand, Kasturbai Lalbhai, Sarabhais, and they were, despite every discouragement by the colonial government, they had established an industrial base for India, which unfortunately was suppressed by this tryst with dalliance, as you call it, with socialism. To what extent do you agree with this statement?
I actually, agree in large measure. In fact, I recall the Swatantra Party of C. Rajagopalachari.
Yes.
Who actually recommended, some of the principles, maybe not in exactly these words, but the importance of private enterprise, the importance of incentives, and but I think we also have to be fair, in our assessment. Do remember that in the 1940s, the evidence against socialism, was not as sort of crystal clear as it is today after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, and China itself, moving to a market economy. So I think I would be, in my books, I would be, I think the investment in heavy enterprise, heavy industry was something that was okay. It is about the 1970s when we really lost our way. In the economic survey, the chapter titled Golden Jubilee of Bank Nationalization, if you look at the idea behind bank nationalization, it was that credit was not flowing to necessary sections of the economy. That was the thought that was felt 50 years back, but that remains equally true today. For instance, if you look at the penetration of private sector credit, private sector credit to GDP in India is about 52%. This is one third the average. I'm not talking about the maximum. One third the average for OECD economies, which is about 160%. And if you take some sections of of India, like for instance the northeastern states, where the private credit to GDP is of the order of 5 to 8%, which is abysmally low. And I think that really captures, together with the fact that for an economy that is the fifth largest in the world, we have only one bank in the global top 100. That's a 55th ranked State Bank of India. And we've had banks which have not invested in technology, that continue to do banking, in the 1950s era, no use of data or very little use of data analytics, etc. In corporate lending, almost all the non-performing assets coming from the large loans, which is something, if the intent was to basically take away the dominance of the corporate houses, for bank nationalization, the fact that credit was basically going to the large corporate houses, the same phenomenon remains today as well. China has 12 banks in the global top 100, that are fraction our size. Countries like Sweden, Switzerland, etc., 1/6 or 1/8 our economic size, have 3 times as many banks in the global top 100. The reason I'm pointing this out is that no country can really grow very fast without its banking sector really backing it. And yet, if you look at the ideas behind bank nationalization, neither of those objectives have really been fulfilled. Neither have we gotten inclusion, nor have we been able to get over the capture of the banks by the large corporates. And so this is something which actually another cardinal sin that we are continuing to pay for over the last 50 years.
So let me take you now to the second question, because I know you're pressed for time. In education world, we believe that universal literacy and high quality, especially primary, secondary education, is the prerequisite of economic and national development. To what extent do you agree with this statement?
I think there's enough research in this area, especially focused on developing economies, but even in developed economies, which clearly shows that primary education, the return, is or the bang for the buck is significant. Now, what I would want to point out though is that in the Indian context, it is not as much the absence of money going into primary education, for instance, but more, the more governance, because now evidence is clearly showing that it's especially the government schools. It's not as if the teachers in the government schools earn less. They are paid well.
They're paid much more than the private school teachers.
Exactly. And yet, the educational outcomes are not being as well reflected. So this is something which is, I think, very important. So what this points out too is the importance of governance, in the education system, especially at the lower levels, to achieve achieve the right outcomes. I think while there may be a case certainly for increasing expenditure more towards the primary education sector, but I think ensuring that the money that is invested is utilized far better by implementing in governance, I think is really important.
So that, in fact, my third question, you touched on that, because my third question is, despite this, national center plus states annual expenditure for public education has remained stuck in the 3 to 3.5% groove in post-independence India, despite several high-powered committees and commissions, starting with the Kothari Committee in 1967, recommended 6% per annum, over 6% per annum. So what do you think is the price that the Indian economy has paid for not heeding the recommendations of these committees and commissions?
I think now, as I was mentioning earlier as well, uh, even if, let's say, you take into account that the percentage, invested has remained the same. I mean, it is on a much larger base compared to
Yes.
what it was, at the time of independence. So,
Mm.
I think what research, especially now, a lot of it focused on India, very careful research has shown is that it's time we start focusing on on the administration, on the governance, of the schools to ensure that the money that is invested generates the bang for the buck. I think it's time that we really think about implementation. I think the new education policy is a very, very promising.
But the two are not mutually exclusive. I'm sure you
No, no,
agree.
no, 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 no. I'm not indicating that at all. All I'm saying is, see, policy making is always about prioritization.
Correct.
And therefore, in terms of between these two, what I'm focusing on is on governance. I don't think that just pouring in more money is necessarily going to bring the kind of outcomes, because we've seen that. But what in terms of prioritization, therefore, I would say, I think it is extremely important that administration and governance become a very important aspect of education. And no, I would like to see some political parties that make education as their key manifesto, and saying that
Exactly.
so in the next 5 years, we will make sure that the ACER test, for instance, so much percentage of class 5 children will be acing that test. I think at the state level, because education is still a state level subject, it would be nice to, yeah, it would be nice to see political parties disrupting, breaking out of the pack, and saying, we are really going to focus on your kids' education. We are going to focus on on your health, for instance, and these are the deliverable outcomes that we promise.
So this
I
what
think
you're saying is,
that.
if what you're saying is self-evident, but why isn't it happening? Do you have perhaps a sociological explanation for it? I mean,
I think that's a good question. It indeed demands a sociological explanation. My sense is that the electorate is possibly not as as not as aware of how administrative reforms in these contexts and better governance can actually help in providing education. I think it's also related to the fact that if you see, parents are voting with their feet. Parents are basically sending their children to private schools. If there is basically, a set of group, maybe a group that comes together and says that, instead of actually voting with your feet, why don't you vote with your finger and ask for, for basically a political party that says, we will equip the government schools to indeed really provide good education. I think, this is something which what it requires is, I'm going to take the example of, I'm not a political expert, nor am I, interested in that area that much. But if you look at some of the recent experiments, that have happened over the last 10 years, there has been some disruption. Basically, some parties that are focused on corruption, and that has become a sort of an agenda. But I think it'll be also useful in Delhi, for instance. Even education has been an important important criterion. I think that's something becoming lot more widespread, large scale, and the electorate asking the MLA, saying, can you basically deliver better education for my kids, and measured by these kind of outcome based measures. I think those would be good. I think it'll be nice for maybe some sociological researchers to examine these questions. I'm not the expert on this. I'm speculating clearly because I've not researched this aspect, but I think that would be something that would be really very, very useful.
So let me go to our next question, sir. In your path-breaking economic survey, you have cited India's ancient political scientists, Kautilya and Tiruvalluvar, in support of the proposition that the invisible hand of the market, supported by the hand of trust, which you just mentioned, is the prescription for national prosperity. Now, the moot point is this prescription valid for the education sector as well?
I think that's an excellent question. I think it is not only valid, it is salient for the education sector. Let me take an example that people usually talk about in a very not in a very positive sense. But let me take the example of this entire coaching industry, whether it's actually for the civil services or for IIT JEE, that actually is, if you think about it, it's a market solution, right? Ideally, what one would have wanted. I'm just going to let me take the example of IIT JEE itself. That if there was, let's say, an honor stream in 11th and 12th, as part of boards, let's say, which as part of the school itself, kids prepared for, what the preparation that is required for the JEE exam, they do it as part of school. There's this, there could have been a curriculum like that, which just trains you for the examination with the same kind of teachers within. But instead, what we've had is, the coaching industry, which is a market-based solution. Now, I will point out, some examples. So I was seeing this video of a teacher, physics teacher, explaining a very difficult concept in physics, which is called rigid body motion. And in the coaching class, actually bringing a cycle rim, rotating it, and showing how actually the cycle rim moves, to basically show three-dimensional motion, in rotation. And I was wondering how beautifully it was explained. So, and there are teachers, for instance, in these coaching institutes that get paid very handsomely. And when I talk to some of the kids in the IITs, they, for instance, say that some of the professors or some of the teachers who taught us during the coaching, were far better than what we get to learn once we enter the particular institute. Now, I'm bringing this as an example. It's a market-oriented solution, which basically has brought in quality. It's only the best that survive, and institutes basically also recruit the best people based on, based on the word of mouth. It's a market-oriented solution for something that is very important, which is that, you learn to, that rigor of mathematics, physics, chemistry. Similarly, if you look at for the civil services as well, one would have thought that there is a stream within our graduates education, which basically equips you for, let's say, the civil services, where you don't necessarily need a coaching institute separately for it. But these are market-oriented solutions, which actually are working and are equipping people. There are people who actually, a large number of candidates who go to this. I think these are illustration of the market-oriented solution. What we need, therefore, is lot more private sector players here who bring quality, who really distinguish themselves based on quality. If, for instance, you look at the there are these school rankings that are published, and those school rankings.
So we publish the world's largest school ranking every year.
Yes. And these rankings, actually, parents look at this very, very carefully to see, which school to. I think that is, it's that ranking is basically a certification of quality. It is, it's a market-oriented solution. Like, you have credit ratings for, for financial instruments which say AAA, AA, etc. When an investor puts money, they basically think about, I want to be investing in the AAA ones. Similarly, parents are putting in, it's also an investment, in fact, possibly a far more important investment in their kid, in their education. They look at these ratings actually, and those ratings do indeed help. I think these are all illustrations of how, the market, and and free enterprise, private enterprise can play an important role. I would say this is also therefore, it's important to also recognize
the standard argument against this is that poor people can't afford private education, and
that's where I feel that, I come back to this, bang for the buck. I mean, think about it as a thought experiment, right? I'm not necessarily saying this is something that needs to be done, because a lot more thought needs to happen on this. But I'm just putting it as a thought experiment. Suppose the investment that is basically going into these some of the schools that, let's say, government schools that don't deliver outcomes at all. Now, suppose if that investment were directed to say, parents were given coupons saying, okay, you can basically go and pay. This is your coupon to actually go and choose the private school where you think your kid will actually get the best education. That
you can choose any school. Why private or public? You can choose. Yes.
Private or public. Actually, I mean, the reason I brought a coupon is because in a public school you may not need that coupon, right? You will need that coupon, for the fee.
Yes.
Only if you have to pay it for a private school.
Yes.
But suppose we actually focus on quality and say those schools that do not measure up, for instance, class 5, this has to be the rate, in terms of, reading, maths, etc. If you're not above this particular threshold, we'll close you down. And that money will be taken and given as coupons where parents can basically go and choose. That would certainly, that would be a way where you actually enable the poor kids to get the best quality education. What happens if you think about it? There are these merit cum means scholarships, where in all the higher education institutions, where nobody gets deprived of the best education just because he or she cannot afford. The same thing can actually be done in the in the primary education and secondary education context as well.
That's a very good point, Dr. Subramanian, because actually the reality is that in public schools, per capita expenditure is perhaps higher than in private schools.
I'm aware of that. I'm aware of that. And that is why I'm actually, mentioning this. And this is, of course, where, again, therefore, the governance, administration at the state level really starts coming in. And that's why, we go back to to education becoming a very important, aspect of political mandates. I think that is very important. But at the same time, the others, so I've talked about free enterprise, the invisible hand of markets, but the hand of trust, I think, is equally important.
Yes.
Education is an intangible product, and in every intangible product, it is intangible because you get to see the value of that only 10, 12 years later, when the kid basically goes and appears for a competitive education examination, or only then. Till that time, you basically get to and so I think it is really important for the private sector here to play for the long run, and therefore, focus on ethical wealth creation, and I say this with enormous seriousness, because one hears a lot of, of stories of, some of these quote unquote not-for-profit being used as vehicles for diverting, sums away. I think that's where the focus on ethical wealth creation therefore becomes important in the context of education, and education institutions therefore really need to inspire the trust. Then the customers will also come as well. Because I think this marriage of ethical wealth creation, of the invisible hand of markets, private enterprise, with the hand of trust, is very important, possibly even more important in the education sphere, because here we're talking about actually an intangible product.
But sir, isn't it true that the government lacks total trust in private education. Because in Delhi itself, where you are stationed, it takes 195 documents and 199 steps inside the Department of Education to promote a new greenfield school. What's your comment?
So this is, part of a larger, push that we've been doing on ease of doing business itself. You would recall in the economic survey, in the January economic survey, there was a chapter on ease of doing business where we actually showed in Delhi, you need far more permissions for setting up a restaurant than to get a gun license. I think those are illustrative of the of the cholesterol that prevails, the regulatory cholesterol that prevails, and oftentimes of the bad variety, which is, I think, so what you're talking about is actually symptomatic of this melee, which we are actually working, in trying to enable ease of doing business in this area. I think what I would broadly say is, it is far more important to recognize quality, and pursuit of quality, and I think let therefore the public sector and private sector, whichever delivers quality, let them prosper. I think that's the key emphasis that has to be that has to be there in the education sphere.
That leads me, sir, to my next question, which is that, contrary to popular belief, almost half of the country's school-going children and 70% of youth are voluntarily in privately promoted education institutions. Yet private schools and higher education, HEIs, higher education institutions, are not trusted and are heavily regulated, which is the question I just asked you. I think you answered it. But perhaps anything to add to that? Or?
No, I think if you see this is something which is quite odd in the Indian context that you see, right? Beyond school, so once a student clears class 12th, for instance, it is the government-owned institutions that are the ones that are the most reputed, whether it's a Delhi University or, an ISI or an IIT or an NIT. These are all government-owned institutions. So, if you look at educational institutions of, higher educational institutions, by far, it is the government-owned ones that are the best quality.
Let me interrupt you, sir. 1 second. That's because until very recently, private universities was virtually impossible to promote private. Now you must have seen that new universities like Ashoka, Jindal, BLM, Munjal, and various others have come up. I think that situation is no longer, what you're saying is no longer true, that government institutions are automatic choice. And even if they are, that's because the fees are heavily over-subsidized.
No, I think I would contest what you're saying. If you look at in the field of engineering, in the field of of business education, MBAs, and there have been many private institutions. I think even during the time when I was studying myself, and yet the fact remains that the institutions that were the ones that people really the brightest students contested to get into were the government institutions. I think that is uncontestable. There is a trust deficit, which is extremely critical. I think we all are aware of some of these fly-by-night operators that who basically had gotten some of these famous film stars to come and advertise for them, people with ponytails and coming and actually talking about. I think such kind of examples really harm the brands enormously. I think the importance of trust is very important. Is really must be emphasized, and this is something which not just in education. See, in our literature itself, while always encouraging free enterprise, there's also the notion of Matsya Nyaya. Matsya Nyaya is basically, Matsya means fish, Matsya Nyaya, and so law of fish in some sense, basically the law of the jungle, where the big fish eat the small fish. That is not what a civilized society actually has as its norms. So what you need is, is private sector that is indeed, well regulated. I'm not saying that, you basically that you should have excessive regulation, but there can't be absolutely no regulation either, especially because the commodity that you're dealing with is an intangible commodity, where the customer, in this case parents, may not understand that commodity very well. They may not have the expertise to be able to understand that commodity, and therefore be able to distinguish between institution X and institution Y. Left basically unregulated, you will have, some of this. So I am for private enterprise, but not for, competition of the jungle, where basically the big eats the small. That is not what a civilized society is about. So there has to be some regulation, especially sectors like healthcare, education, which deal with intangible products, to ensure that the quality is adequate. But that, we need to have good cholesterol, but eliminate the bad cholesterol. I think zero cholesterol is not good for the body, nor is it good for education either.
So would I be correct in interpreting what you're saying as your advice to private institutions that they should inspire trust?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I am actually saying it explicitly, that, not only, so this is my message to always to corporate India itself, that they basically need to, if they want to play for the long run. I'll take examples of, firms that have existed, for long times, or educational institutions, educational brands that inspire trust. Harvard, Yale, Chicago, these kind of brands. They have actually, existed by playing for the long run, and that is something which, all the institutions need to learn if they want to be there. Actually, that their labor of love that they're putting in now is something that is, that benefits the next generation, and the generation after that, and the generation after it. Then trust is something that has to be placed at a premium. This, in general, this, phenomenon of basically growing rich quick, is, I think, very likely the shortcut to Tihar jail.
So conversely, I'm sure you agree that government also has to trust private institutions, and those who breach that trust should be punished rather than prevented by excessive regulation from promoting institutions.
No, I think, see, I have already made the point that excessive regulation, I don't believe that. But, if you think about, we economists actually model trust as a game, where trust from one party begets more trust from the other.
Reciprocal.
When one party actually behaves in a less trustworthy manner, then that also leads to the other party to actually behave in an untrustworthy manner. And then what you get is what is called a Nash equilibrium, where both parties then coexist in a equilibrium of low trust. So I think this is something which we have to, to get over. It is important that the regulations are reduced. Bad cholesterol is removed, good cholesterol is brought in. But at the same time, I think there is no denying the fact that, behavior from many of the private educational institutions also needs to be towards the long run and needs to inspire trust. They need to really, care about every student that they're admitting. I think in the context of education, averages are not enough, because what you're talking about are lives of people. Of, let's say, 700, 800 students, if you're admitting, even if one student does not get placed well, that one student actually, his or her, career and life going forward is affected. That's the kind of vision, that's the kind of ethics that has to inspire, institutions. Actually, hiding behind averages, is I think not good enough in the context of intangible assets like education and health. Even if one person is unhealthy, ask him or her the pain that he or she goes through. Averages don't work in these kind of sectors. So educational institutions really need to actually deliver their product to the last person, and that's the mandate with which they have to work with.
That's very good advice. Thank you. Just one or two questions more, sir. In the recently enacted National Education Policy 2020, hardly any mention is made of private schools, despite 47% of all in-school children being in private education. It mandates the establishment of an entire alphabet soup of regulatory agencies to monitor, regulate schools and higher education institutions. What's your comment about the NEP 2020?
I think we've already had a conversation on this, Dilip. I think, as I said that, we...
No, you said you're not in favor of excessive regulation, but do you see any traces of excessive regulation and sort of disdain for private enterprise in the policy?
Those are strong words. I wouldn't use those.
Well, it's hardly mentioned. That's
whether or not that the specific mention is made is not as important as what is the vision that is driving the NEP. And I think private sector and public sector are but instruments for achieving that vision. I don't think there is anywhere any hostility to the private sector. By the very fact that it is not being mentioned, which means there is no hostility either. I think the fact that both need to coexist is therefore being very well recognized. And as I said, regulation, and the optimal amount of regulation is an aspect that we have to work on, in the Indian context, not only in education but elsewhere as well. This is part of the broader theme of ease of doing business, where we sort of create the optimal amount of regulation. What you're seeing is actually symptomatic of something that it needs to be fixed across the board.
So, last question. How optimistic are you about the future of Indian education and the national resolve and capability to develop the country's abundant, high potential human resources?
See, first of all, I am an incorrigible optimist. So, maybe you're asking the question of a wrong person. You will very rarely hear a pessimistic answer from me.
Okay, what about the national resolve to, is there sufficient will? Because as we discussed through the interview, education is not moving up the agenda of any political party or even society, or perhaps not any political party.
No, I would disagree. The fact that the NEP has been brought about, with people, like the field medal winner in mathematics being, a part of this group actually, and contributing, very, very strongly. In fact, I had the opportunity to also meet him,
Dr. Manjul Bhargava.
Dr. Manjul Bhargav, and stalwarts like that being involved in crafting the NEP, I think suggests the seriousness of education, and the fact that the central government recognizes how important this is. I think the group that worked on creating the NEP was stellar in terms of the kind of credentials that they brought in. The fact that such a group was assembled is indicative of the resolve to really focus on education. I think so. I would disagree that this is not part. This is indeed part of the agenda. Now we have to basically double down on taking that and implementing those ideas. So I think I actually remain quite optimistic despite my saying that I'm an incorrigible optimist. I think this is one area where India can really benefit from. I think the NEP has the ingredients for really furthering this initiative. And I think with the kind of demography that we have, and with the focus that is being put on the right ingredients in the NEP, I think we basically need to focus now on implementing it. And as I said, and I think that is one key message that I want to convey is, for parents to focus on administration and governance, ask the right questions, because, if there is one area that I really think about, which is more important than even, pouring money, it is about governance and administration, to ensure that the implementation aspect, happens very well. I think if each set of parents basically, or parents group in every school, can take the onus to ask questions of the school administration, and thereby keep the school administrations on their toes in delivering education for the kids. After all, it is in the parents' interest to actually take care of that. And one of the things, and we've been doing some research here as well. And what we find is that schools where the parental involvement is actually greater are indeed those that deliver, within the same board, deliver better outcomes. This is about implementation. So I think the ingredients actually, in terms of the goals to pursue, are very much there. Now it's about implementation, and I would emphasize again governance. And I think citizens need to ask questions on the governance of teachers basically being asked only to teach, not being put into any other activities. And at the same time, teachers checking whether teachers are basically present, teaching properly. These are the kind of basically a ground level aspects and ground level issues that parents need to be concerned about. I think not parents of basically of our demographic. We, people like us, we are enlightened enough to ask these questions, but it is more at the lower levels where organizations like yours need to really take it to the parents, actually maybe come up with vernacular issues where not just in English but vernacular media highlight these aspects to parents, and motivate them to go and ask these questions. Because finally, I think it is that last mile, implementation, administration and governance that can make the biggest difference. And that can happen just by each parent or each group of parents actually taking that responsibility.
You'll be pleased to know we've offered our magazine for translation into vernacular languages, as you suggested, free of charge to anybody. But I regret to inform you, not a single person has stepped forward for that. That perhaps is an indicator of the priorities.
Maybe there is a market-oriented solution there that we actually, that you may want to explore. Actually, maybe.
Well, we've been exploring.
Venture capital investment that basically brings in some of this, because there is clearly value there. I think it's a market failure that is right now in vernacular not happening. So some investment, I think, just something that we can think about.
Yes, indeed. Well, Dr. Subramanian, thank you very much for a very insights-rich interview, and it's wonderful to share the benefits. And we wish you the best of luck in your own efforts to liberalize, deregulate, and promote the invisible hand of the market supported by the hand of trust. Thank you very much.